Welcome, and thank you for joining Career Conversations. On this episode, we're joined by 2013 Beckman Young investigator, Dr. Delphine Farmer, who's currently working on lots of field studies out and analyzing the environment, and I'm very excited to hear about where you started and how you got to where you are and what kind of activities you do out in your field studies. But, to begin, we kind of like to think about the beginning. Where did your passion for science start? And was it high school or college?
Uh, I think I think I first started getting excited about science when I was actually really little. My father was an oceanographer, and so he studied the sound in the ocean and used that to think about how oceans, move around and water, and how the water interacts with the atmosphere. So I knew what science was from a young age, and I think the formative moments for me when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, going down to the pier near where we lived on the coast of Vancouver Island in Canada. And I remember my father putting down this microphone, and you could hear all the different shrimp and all the different animals in the ocean. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, you can't see them, but you can hear them. And that, I think, was the sort of the moment I realized that I really wanted to be an environmental scientist. I wanted to see what was out in the world. And from then on, it was just, I think I went through many stages of trying all sorts of different types of environmental science. And I somehow ended up as an atmospheric chemist.
Yeah, I'm very curious. I'm going to go look up what a shrimp sounds like.
Yeah, clicks and clacks.
That sounds awesome. So, that's great. Your father really got you interested, but I mean, you must have had to move around, and you say you ended up in atmospheric chemistry. What kind of path did you take? Where did you
Yeah.
get started?
So I started I was an undergraduate student at McGill University in Montreal, and my problem was that I was too interested in everything. So in our freshman year, we took physics and chemistry and biology, and I honestly couldn't decide what I wanted to do. And so we had to declare a major, and the day before we had to declare a major, I looked at the program, all the different majors I could have, and the one that I could start and then change my mind was chemistry, because chemistry is used in everything. So all of the major requirements in my second year of undergrad for chemistry would mean that I could switch to being a biologist or a physicist or anything else I really wanted without losing any time. And so I just decided I would delay making a decision about what I was going to do. And I was just going to declare a major in chemistry. And then the problem is that I absolutely fell in love with it in my second year, and I realized I didn't need to change my major. I could just continue to be a chemist and be happy. I loved all of the classes I took, especially physical chemistry. Turns out I'm not very good in the lab, so being a synthetic chemist was not going to happen. But and then I knew that I also wanted to do something with environmental work. And so I took some classes in atmospheric chemistry. I took some classes in ecology, and I realized that I wanted to do environmental chemistry. And it was also when time to apply to graduate school was in the winter. And so in December in Montreal, it is very cold. And so I only applied to graduate schools in California. And I applied to all sorts of programs. And then that spring semester, I visited various universities, and I fell in love with Berkeley in Northern California. And I started out thinking about the chemistry of ecosystems and soil chemistry. And I did my master's degree in soil chemistry. But while I was doing that, I was looking at nitrogen and how it moved between soils and forests. And what I realized is the most interesting piece to me was that this nitrogen that would get into soils would then move into the atmosphere. And so that brought me back to atmospheric chemistry. And so I moved up the hill at Berkeley and joined the chemistry department for my PhD, and studied nitrogen and how it moves between forests and the atmosphere. And that was really my path into where I am now.
So was that something that you fell into at Berkeley, or how did you kind of make that move? Was there a mentor up there who was ready to
Yes.
take you in that lab and that's what they're doing, or did you kind of build that
Yeah.
program yourself?
So I started realizing when I was doing that master's work that movement of nitrogen from soils into the air was really interesting. And there was a professor up in the chemistry department, Ron Cohen, and he was studying those same nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere and what they did. And my roommate at the time was actually a graduate student in his group, and she suggested that I go talk to him. And I went and talked to him, and he started telling me about the work that he was doing. And I got really excited. And I just knew, for two reasons. One, the science was really exciting. And also, I just really enjoyed that conversation. And I felt like, okay, this is gonna be really hard and I'm gonna learn a lot. And that's what I want to do next. So it was both a combination of meeting the right mentor and also the right piece of science.
Yeah, and the right roommate.
Exactly.
You never know. So what'd you do after that degree at Berkeley?
So my PhD, it was actually a very natural progression. So my PhD, I worked up at a forest field site in the Sierra Nevadas in California. And what we saw every day was this urban plume from Sacramento moving up the mountains towards Lake Tahoe. And I was sitting at a forest site, sort of halfway in between Sacramento and Tahoe. And so every day we would watch this plume with these sort of really detailed laser-induced fluorescence measurements of nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere. And so we would watch the nitrogen get into the forest, and then I could see the forest have a response. And I was measuring this movement of nitrogen in and out of the forest. And when I started writing papers and reading the literature, I realized that this could have really interesting implications to particles in the air. So we were studying the gases. And I suddenly realized there were these really interesting particles and molecules that moved between the gas and the particle phase in the forest. And so when I was reading the literature, there was one name that kept on coming up, and a set of instrumentation that people had just begun developing to look at those aerosols using mass spectrometry. And so I contacted this professor, Jose Jimenez at CU Boulder, and he was studying particles. And I told him, I really want to look at how particles move in and out of forests and how they respond to all these changes. And he was like, that sounds really cool, but really hard. Come do a postdoc in my group. And so I got a fellowship and went out to CU Boulder. And first went back to my field site in the Sierra Nevadas, just with a totally different instrument. I knew nothing about mass spectrometry at the time, but suddenly in the middle of nowhere with very little internet access or cell phones, was running a new instrument and trying to make it work really fast. And then we turned around and took that instrument down to Brazil, to the Amazon, to then go and look at a very, very different ecosystem, much cleaner system, not really much human-induced pollution. So that was my foray into thinking about forest-atmosphere exchange and moving from gases to particles. And then I started realizing I have all sorts of questions of my own. So I wanted to become have my own faculty position in my own research group. This position at Colorado State was just the right fit for me. And so then I had to make a decision about types of instrumentation to work on, and mass spectrometry seemed like a really exciting way to look at the atmosphere. So that's where my group started out, was thinking about new ways of using mass spectrometry to look at the atmosphere. And we've continued to look at how humans change the air we're breathing.
Yeah. So do you have a lab in a lab, or are you out in the field? What does it look like?
We have a lab here at CSU, but I often think of it a little more like a storage facility in between field projects. So we have several mass spectrometers. Most of them, if they're in the lab, we're trying to figure out how to develop new calibration techniques or how to work them better in the field, make them a little more resilient. And then we tend to move them out to different field sites. So last week I was at a field site. We're out in New York on Long Island, sitting with inlets that go all the way up a cell phone tower. and 100 meters up, and we're looking at what's going in and out of a suburban area on Long Island in terms of all the different gases and particles. And then yesterday, I was in Tennessee at a different field site where we're over a beautiful oak and hickory forest, and we're looking at how particles that are formed in that Tennessee area outside of Knoxville, how they're depositing into the forest. So we're still doing lots of new measurements and trying to use them to think about new science questions.
How does all those sound so far apart from each other? But this is a real cohesive research program. Can you kind of describe, like, what is your research program?
Yeah, so all of the projects that my group is doing really center around the same set of questions, and that is how are humans changing the air that we breathe, and how is that impacting forests and human health? And so I'm constantly looking not just at, we measure the concentration, but we're really after understanding the process and how things are moving from the air to surfaces or from particles back into the air. We're really always trying to understand those exchange processes. And so that exchange process might be between a forest surface, so leaves in the atmosphere, or that exchange process might be between gases and particles, or it might even be between the surfaces and the walls inside a house to the air that we're breathing inside our home. So, but all of the work in my group is using new and advanced chemical instrumentation to really think about the processes that control the air that we're breathing.
Wow, cool. Thanks for that explanation. It always sounds so fascinating when you're talking. Just kind of thinking back, and especially, in the spirit of this podcast, what would you say was one of the biggest resources that you used, to discover what you wanted to do, how you approached that problem?
Yeah, I think the biggest resource is just listening to other people and being curious about what they're talking about. And I go to meetings and I love to go and listen to plant ecologists talk about the problems that they're seeing, or people studying agriculture and how they're concerned about, wildfire smoke and what it's doing to plants. Or I go and I hear people who are worried about the air they're breathing inside. And then I think that's the biggest resource, is just listening to other scientists and what they're interested in, and then talking to them and thinking about ways I can help them answer questions, and they can help me think about new problems. And I think that's been a really incredible resource. I think the other piece, of course, is having really great scientists and friends to talk to. And my roommate, who I went to grad school with, who encouraged me to go and work in atmospheric chemistry, she's still remained one of my best friends. And she is a professor at the University of Toronto. And we talk all the time. And she studies amines and reduced organic nitrogen and how that moves through agricultural systems. And she constantly makes me curious about how we can think about things like organic carbon and how that might relate to her measurements, or how we can share techniques to think about similar problems. So I talk to a lot of friends and scientists, and they always keep me thinking about new and exciting problems.
What kind of advice would you give someone who's maybe, picking a major so that they can change it later,
Well, I would say chemistry is a really great one to start with if you're not sure what you want to do, because you can take it and do anything. You can go and study the air, you can go and study plants, you can go and study the oceans. But I think maybe the biggest piece of advice is to not worry too much about what you're going to do long term, but make sure that you're just doing something that you really love. And if you're not doing something you really love, try something different. And I think it's really important to remember that science is fun, and it should be really fun. And so constantly looking for and finding questions that are exciting, and finding ways to work in, whether it's in lab, or for me, it's actually not working in lab, it's working in the field, finding things that you really enjoy. And that's what I think makes science such a great career, is you can just do what you find fun.
Great advice. Wish everybody's job was fun.
I know it's not always all the time, but most of the time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Any other little nuggets you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I think the one biggest thing I'll share in terms of thinking about careers is to not worry too much about, a lot of field scientists were, they certainly didn't look like me. My father and all his colleagues were a lot of a lot of men, and now field science is changing and it's much more welcoming and it's much more open. So I would just encourage lots of people to come and try field science if you're curious about it, and if you're curious about the environment. It's a really open and welcoming and collaborative field. And I think the best thing is that we as a community, certainly atmospheric chemists, welcome all sorts of other people to come join us, because that's where the really exciting science happens. So when we go and talk to microbiologists, turns out there are microbes in the air and they do interesting things, and we're really welcoming to other communities. Same with data scientists or physicists. And so I think finding a field that's really collaborative and really open and welcoming to different types of scientists and different types of people is a real joy.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear not just men anymore.
Yes,
As
definitely not.
That's great. Well, thank you so much again for your time. We appreciate hearing about your journey and the advice that you're able to share.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.